Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this June, I keep getting the month wrong, June talk for the Nottingham and Derby BCS branch. Very happy to introduce Sorrel to you tonight. I've been hoping to get to one of Sorrel's talks for a good while now and haven't managed it. So instead, I've invited her to talk at one of my talks. So I'm really looking forward to this. So just a few notes before we start, before I pass over to Sorrel. If I can move my slides on. Microphones and videos will be off during Sorrel's presentation. Once the presentation is finished and we've moved to questions, we will allow people to kind of unmute and ask questions if they wish. Otherwise, you can post your questions in either the questions pane or the chat, depending on what we have available here. You can post your questions as we go through, and then we'll pick them up at the end for Sorrel to answer. So while you're here, please be respectful, be aware of other people, and yeah, and we'll have a really good evening. Just a bit of a plug for the branch for those of you who are maybe not members of the BCS or not members of the branch. You can kind of have a look at what we're doing, what we're about on the website. You can join our LinkedIn group as well, where we can post events and things that are coming up. So there's some details there, which we'll put in the chat shortly. And finally, if you're not a member of the BCS but wish to join, you can get a 20% discount using code BCSNOTS20, should anybody wish to do that. Okay, I think that's it for me. So I shall stop sharing my screen and pass over to Sorrel.
Thanks, Beverly. Hi, everybody. Just bear with me a moment while I work out how to share my screen. Is that, can you see the slides, Beverly?
Yes, can see them fine.
Lovely. So I didn't realise, I should have checked beforehand whether or not people would be able to unmute themselves or use a video. So there's a couple of points in this presentation where I ask questions, which you may just have to respond using the reactions. I think you can react from the toolbar at the bottom, if I'm correct. So there might be one or two occasions when I ask you to react. So yeah, we'll see how that goes.
Okay. If you want me to let people unmute, I can do.
Oh, I think it'll be all right. There's a couple of points as well where I'll just pause for people to reflect for a couple of minutes. So you don't really need to be able to speak for that. It's more just private reflection.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, hi. Thank you, Beverly and BCS Nottingham and Derby for inviting me to speak with you this evening. And thanks everybody who's shown up. I'm going to start by introducing myself and sharing a bit about my background. And I'm going to do that in the form of a quite unscientific chart, which kind of describes my career, but in terms of kind of pivotal moments in my learning history. So it goes something like this. So I started out as a web designer quite a long time ago now. I'm not going to say how long. But then I did go, after a few years, I went back to university to study acoustics, which is what my PhD is in. But the learning that's really stayed with me from the PhD, because to be honest, I can't remember an awful lot about acoustics. The most useful learning was really around the sort of analytical skills that you gain when you do a PhD, the research skills. You learn a lot about how to learn, which is, you know, it's a great luxury to have that opportunity as a PhD student to do all that meta learning. After that, I thought I'd give teacher training a go, as you do. And I think that was partly because I didn't really see myself as a lecturer then. And I don't know if you know anybody that's done initial teacher training, whether or not they became a teacher after it. But it is one of the hardest things I've ever done. And it really profoundly changed me and changed my confidence levels. And so it's because of that that I then went on to become a lecturer in computer science, which I did for a number of years. But I was finding it very difficult being part of a system, and I wonder if there's any others in HE who might be able to relate to this. I found it hard being part of a system that didn't seem to want to learn. And I'm wondering if anybody here has ever experienced that kind of frustration that comes with being in a system in which people are suffering. I don't think it's too strong a word to use, the word suffering. And it feels like every change that's kind of inflicted on the system doesn't really do anything to alleviate that suffering. So this is a point where I was going to say, react if you can relate to being in a system like this, where the system doesn't seem to want to learn. And for me, that felt quite ironic, being an education establishment. Anyway, so to cut that long story short, I came across this thing called Agile, and I came across people like Matthew Skelton, who is a co-author of a book called Team Topologies. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of it. But I saw that they were doing all this cool stuff that was about building better technical systems by building better social systems, or at least recognizing that the two things are connected, and also recognizing the importance of continuous learning. So it was after that, those kind of revelations, that I did leave academia to work for a consultancy called Armakuni, where my role was something like kind of a cross between a learning and development advisor and an agile coach. That's the best way I can think of to describe it. But what it was trying to bring learning and development closer to delivery, closer to software delivery. And so I've continued along that pathway as an independent learning coach and consultant now, what I'm really trying to do is enable autonomous learning at every level in an organization. So at the level of individuals, teams, and at the level of the whole organization. And I'm going to come back to this chart a bit later because there's a couple of things that I wanted to say about it, but I'll come back to that. So before I move on, so I've told you quite a lot about myself. So I want to just pause for a moment to ask you, rhetorically, because I know you can't really respond, whether or not you can say that key decisions that you've taken in your career or in your life have been tied in some way to your learning. I don't know if the reactions work, but if you feel that that applies to you, you can react. And I think if this does apply to you, the reason is because we're learning systems. So we're primed for learning. It's what we do. It's what motivates us. And I want you to, again, focus on can you pick out one particularly important decision that you've taken in your career, a pivotal moment maybe, and think about what was the learning that fueled that? What was it that you became aware of that you hadn't previously been aware of? And I'm just going to pause for a few moments just so that you have the opportunity to think about that. There's one or two people putting some thoughts into the chat, which of course you're very much welcome to do, although you don't have to share publicly. But it's lovely to see some comments popping up in the chat. Okay, so I will move on, but we'll come back to that a bit later on. So still to come in the talk, I'm going to try to answer these two questions. Why should we focus on enabling autonomous learning, and how might we enable it? And the how is a much bigger question. I'm not going to be able to address all of the how in this session, but I'm going to try and give you a starting point to go away with. So first, I'm going to give you a bit of context to start with. So we're in the modern technology era, and conditions are constantly changing all around us, and we need to be able to respond quickly to change. And I think that applies to every component in what is actually a complex network of systems. So we can say it about whole organizations, we can say it about ourselves as individuals, we can say it about teams, and we can also say it about technical systems that we build. So really never have we as individuals and the systems that we build needed to be more resilient against change and uncertainty than we're finding now. And in response to this need, I've noticed, and this is a positive thing, I've noticed that people are increasingly learning to see organizations as complex adaptive systems that are made up of people who are also complex adaptive systems. And when people start to think about organizations like that, then they might find that they spend a bit less time and energy trying to control the individual parts in the system, and a bit more energy trying to understand how the parts in the system interact and affect the behavior of the system as a whole. And at that point, then they may also think about the environment, the culture, and the lived experiences of people in the system. And I was recently at a conference, I was at Lead Dev last week, and I saw loads of evidence of this. It was really heartening to see that people are really recognizing now that those are the things that drive the behavior of the whole system. And so I think this kind of gets us to the heart of why we need to be focusing on enabling autonomous learning. Because whereas in the past, we've tended to use learning and development as a way to control parts in the system, we now need learning to be something that systems do for themselves. And there's research that backs this up, which I can direct you to after the talk if you're interested in going deeper. So, as the enablers of learning in our increasingly turbulent systems, we need to care less about progressing individuals along those predictable pathways and more about creating the environment and the culture in which people and teams will learn continuously and autonomously. So we need to train our systems to learn. And unfortunately, Western style approaches to education and training haven't really tended to do this very well. So this is quite upsetting for me, as you can imagine. My 8-year-old son says to me, I hate learning. And that's because he equates learning with rote learning and memorizing facts. And the techniques that he's using to learn at school, like sitting at a desk and writing things out, they don't feel connected to his goals and interests. So he's already kind of drawn this conclusion that learning isn't something he enjoys and it's not something for him, which is terrible. Schools should do the opposite of that. It should leave every child feeling that learning is something they love and can do well in their own ways. But of course, it's very difficult to do that for 30 children with different needs and different interests. I really love this quote from the late Ken Robinson, who says that we have to recognise that human flourishing is not a mechanical process, it's an organic process. And you can't predict the outcome of human development. All you can do, like a farmer, is create the conditions under which they will begin to flourish. And of course, he's talking about education in schools, he's talking about human systems. But I think that this also applies to socio-technical systems. It's telling us, like, we need to look after them. We need to look after them so they can self-learn. So we need to become stewards of self-learning systems. And all of this kind of underlines why I think we need to be thinking about learning as a capability rather than an activity that we can schedule. We also need to recognise that there's a relationship between learning as a capability and flow, which, for those who aren't familiar with this concept of flow, it's that sort of mindful, creative state where we're kind of one with the tasks that we're doing. And for people to be able to achieve that flow state, we need to find kind of like a sweet spot between having the skills we need to do the task, but also finding the task sufficiently interesting, which is obviously where school systems failing somewhat. But learning behaviours can help us to reach that sweet spot for ourselves. And some examples of learning behaviours are shown in the red here. But again, I want to emphasise that this doesn't just apply to individuals, it applies to teams and whole organisations, because it's the learning behaviours that keep things flowing, though they might manifest differently at different levels. So the red things might manifest differently for different levels. So going back to my learning chart, I'm now going to draw attention to the dark and light blue lines, which I didn't mention before. But the light blue lines represent knowledge and skills acquisition, which is where learning and development, education traditionally focus. And the dark blue line represents awareness development. And by that, I mean awareness of the self and the systems in which we operate. And it also includes the ability to apply learning, because that obviously hinges on awareness. And another way of describing these different types of learning is as vertical and horizontal learning. You might have come across this idea before. So this is a quote from a coach, Dorothy Siminovich, who says that horizontal learning is essentially technical training. It's a transfer of content, information, techniques in focused areas. And the counterpart of horizontal learning is vertical development, which highlights awareness development. But she also emphasises that these are two complementary, not competing models. So we need both. And so when we go back to the chart again, and yeah, okay, this is very unscientific. It's just me sketching it out. And you can do it yourself. It's quite an interesting exercise to try on yourself. And I'd be interested to learn if you observe anything similar. But I noticed that at times when I've been experiencing rapid horizontal development, the vertical development slowed down. They've not both been increasing rapidly at the same time, and sort of vice versa. And this kind of makes sense to me because each type of learning kind of requires us to exercise different learning capabilities. So for example, for vertical development, for that awareness building, we do need a lot of space, both in terms of our busy work, so gaps in our busy work, and cognitive space. So we need to avoid the cognitive overload, which is a huge barrier to this kind of learning. And we also need things like feedback, which is to feed that vertical development. So here's the thing, if as an organisation we invest only in the horizontal development of our systems, then we might be slowing down their vertical growth. And it's that we really need to help the system adapt to change. Because these are balancing forces, so we need to take care of both. And it's my belief that we don't currently invest enough into that vertical learning. So the next thing then is I want us to think about where we might start if we sort of have hopefully made a strong enough case for why we should care about enabling autonomous learning. both horizontal and vertical. But where do we start? So I think the most obvious place to start is with ourselves. And as Sanger tells us, organisations learn only through individuals who learn. Because of course we're all learning systems to varying extents, and we all form larger systems, social and technical. And so for these systems to also be capable of learning and adaptation, then we really need to give some thought to what it means to be a learning system and work on becoming better learning systems ourselves. You know, when do we ever think about that? It's not something we think about at school. We're not taught about it at school. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to think about it. I'm going to pause for a minute or two again, and I want you to think this time about what do you think are the characteristics of learning systems? Like, how would you spot a system that learns? And you might want to cast your mind back to that kind of pivotal decision that you took in your career that I asked you to think about earlier, that you felt was driven by learning, and wonder sort of what strengths or personal attributes did you draw on at that point? What enabled you to get there? And if you want to, you can drop your thoughts in the chat, but it's also fine if you just want to keep your thoughts to yourself. So I'm going to give you a minute or so to have a think about that. So there's been a few suggestions popping up in the chat, all of which really resonate with me. It would be great if we had the opportunity to have a longer conversation just about these ideas that are popping up. It's really fascinating. So I'm going to move us along then. So I'm going to give you some characteristics of learning systems that I came up with. So the column on the left, I've kind of come up with these 6 characteristics that I think kind of are embodied by learning systems. So self and systems awareness, autonomy, empowerment, resilience. I think that did come up in the chat as well. Analytical skills and change fit or change fitness. I think these 6 sort of characteristics, I think they apply to any system, whether it's social or technical, as I've tried to sort of illustrate with sort of expansion on this in the central and right columns. You can adapt the metaphor basically. So how these different characteristics or embodied changes depending on the type of system that we're thinking about. But it's important to note that all of these characteristics can be cultivated. We can practice these. We can train ourselves in these. We can work on specific learning behaviours or tactics in order to cultivate these. So things like seeking feedback, pair programming, holding retrospectives, loads of activities that we can do in order to cultivate these kind of learning characteristics. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm just going to give you a few tools and exercises that you could use with yourself to become a better learning system. And there are, of course, heaps of other tools for enabling learning at the other levels, at the team and organisational levels. But we're going to start at the roots, so to speak. We're going to start with ourselves. But if you want to learn about tools and techniques that you can use at the other levels, if you're a leader or a team member, then you can always speak to me after the talk. So the first tool I'm going to give you is the personal SWOT analysis, which some of you may have heard me talk about before. I really like this tool. I think it's a really good starting point for identifying your next goal or target state in the sort of with the goal of becoming more deliberate and more sort of strategic about our learning. But it can also be used in a team, so it doesn't have to just be for the individual. And it can be a great backdrop for a coaching conversation or a one-to-one, where the goal is to focus your learning, but it also opens up the door for feedback. So it provides a kind of structure and a safe way to kind of introduce feedback into a conversation with somebody that you manage or a peer. So the 4 quadrants are strengths, weaknesses, which I prefer to call growth edges, and opportunities and threats. So I'll just go into these a little bit more. So we start by thinking about our strengths, the things that we're doing well at the moment. Sometimes it can help to think about a recent challenge and how we overcame it. Actually, some people struggle with this bit. It's not always easy to know what we're good at. And so again, this is where, you know, having a second person, having other people around to feed into this can be really beneficial. It's a good idea to set a time frame for this exercise of maybe sort of 3 to 12 months, rather than having it span all of time, just because we're wanting to use it to focus our learning in the present. But it's also okay if you want to think about strengths more generally, especially if you may be new in a role or you're struggling and you really need to be reminded about what's in your arsenal. But then we move on to growth edges, where we're kind of reflecting on the things that have challenged us within the time frame we're looking at and have left us feeling less than satisfied. So these could be things that we know we struggle with. In this example here, we can imagine that the person doing this exercise has started from a point of thinking about something that they're struggling with, which is manifesting as sort of frustration. But rather than just turn that on to other people, sort of, you know, oh, it's everyone else's fault that I'm feeling this way, they've identified some growth edges from that for themselves around self-management and influencing. And again, sometimes this is something we need help to do from someone else. It is not always easy to make that sort of constructive leap to identify our growth edges. Then we move down to the opportunities and threats, where again, it can be extremely useful to have another perspective, because you're seeking here to identify things that might threaten your progress in relation to those weaker areas or challenges, and also things that could be enablers for you. So sometimes we're just not aware of the opportunities that are available to us. This might be a place where feedback from others could help to alert us to internal threats as well. So there might be patterns in our behaviour, for example, that are stopping us from moving forward. So again, it's a great tool for managers or, you know, peer-to-peer learning, because it just gives your conversation that sort of structure and a safe way to introduce feedback. So I'm going to move on to tool 2 then. As following your SWOT analysis, what you really want to be doing then is identifying some meaningful, actionable goals, learning goals, I should say, which you can then iterate towards. And so this is where learning tool 2 can be really helpful. So what you're looking at here, though, is the beginning of what I call a learning backlog. So it's just, this has just come from a Miro board, and it's just somebody trying to visualize their learning goals. And it's got 4 columns to it. So we've got the goal, the thing that they want to learn, the target state, if you like. And then the actions column is essentially like the small experiments that they're going to take to move towards that target state. Then we've got a measurements column, which is really just giving them a way of recognizing when they've made an improvement or when they've made progress towards that goal. So measurements don't have to be quantitative, they can be qualitative, they can be based on feelings. That's totally fine. It's just, how are you going to recognize improvement? And then finally, the 4th column is like a deadline column, just because you want to be time boxing your you're going to be, you know, you may need several iterations to get to where you want to get to, but you're not going to be doing 20 experiments in one iteration. So give yourself a sort of realistic time frame in which to do some things that are realistic in that time frame, if that makes sense. So in the process of identifying those learning goals, there's 4 questions you can use that can really help here, to make sure that the goals that you set are effective and right for you. And you might, so the 4 questions that I'm giving you here are based on what you might recognize them, the lean principles. So you can use these questions to guide you when goal setting. So the first question we've got here, question 1, what is the value in learning this? This is just about understanding value, understanding the value of what you're seeking to learn. So for that, you need that vertical systems awareness in order to know that what you're doing is actually benefiting the system. Question 2, then, what activities can generate value? That's where you get to defining actions that you're going to take to generate that value. So it's making sure that you're connected. Bearing in mind you don't have to do everything at once. The 3rd question, where can I apply this in my work? That is about establishing pull, because it's about figuring out how to make sure that we're able to practice or apply what we're learning now, because that's what's going to create that pull, being able to apply the learning in the work or practice the thing in the work we're doing, to make the learning impactful. And that might seem obvious how you're going to do that, but sometimes it isn't. And so you might need to think carefully about how you're going to do that, because if your learning's too detached from the work you're doing, that can make it difficult to sustain or to have longer term impact. And then the 4th question is, how will I maintain progress? So that's about maintaining flow or forwards momentum. So that's important to think about as well. Like, how am I going to maintain progress here? How am I going to maintain momentum in this learning? And so it might mean thinking about what habits and behaviours you can draw on to support your learning. So just as an example, you might decide that you're going to communicate your intentions to others to introduce some accountability, because that's going to going to be what helps you maintain that flow. But yeah, so all of these 4 questions, you know, just a good way to sort of check that, you know, that the goal's right, that that it's a good quality learning goal. And then to make this even more successful, I'd suggest finding a way to communicate what you're working on to others. So this can not only help to foster alignment around learning in your team or organisation, as well, but it also helps to foster awareness around how the learning you're doing benefits other systems that you're connected to. But it also, another thing it does is helps, it enables people to support one another. So it might mean that you're able to form communities around learning, which again can increase learning impact. So, you know, a way to do this, for example, would be to, you know, just maybe if you're in a team, be able to communicate at the start of, say, if you have an inset day or a learning day, have a way of communicating to others what you're working on, so that could invite collaboration from others. Okay, last tool I'm going to give you, and sorry, there's a lot, you don't have to read all of the post-its on the board or anything, it's just illustrative, because what this is about integrating different goals. So in this example, the exercise I'm doing here is trying to integrate learning goals with work and life goals. But it doesn't have to be work and life, it could be individual and group level learning goals. So it's recognizing that although you're one person, you belong to different systems, and we need some way of kind of testing whether their respective goals are kind of working well together. Can they be integrated? So if they don't, like if there's conflict or they lack connection, then this could be problematic. It could mean that, you know, the learning you're doing, either it doesn't have any impact or something's actually, you know, something could, you know, there could be something that detracts from your learning elsewhere. So this is what I'm using here is causal analysis, which you might have come across before. It's a tool from the systems thinking toolbox. And it's just about looking at the relationships between things, in this case goals, and thinking about how they feed or impede one another. And to use this or practice this or any of the other techniques that I've talked about, you don't need anything. You can just use pen and paper or a whiteboard. You don't need a template or anything. These are little exercises you can just do for yourself. Of course, you do need some time and you need some motivation. So don't do it when you're exhausted at the end of a long day. Learning is effortful. It does require time and effort. There's no kind of way of avoiding that. But the good thing is, if we do exercise these kind of metacognitive muscles every now and then through exercises like this, which don't have to be done every week, it just, you know, you might find it useful to do this every now and then. What you find is that you're practicing kind of these metacognitive skills that are actually might benefit you elsewhere. So you might find that these kind of ways of thinking and making connections between things or recognizing connections between things, that starts to come more naturally, and you start to do more of that in your work and in other areas of your work. So I'm going to pause again now. We are sort of getting towards the end of the talk. So I'm going to give you a moment to think about yourself as a learning system. And I want you to think about, what would your learning dashboard look like? What characteristics might you personally need to work on next? And you don't have to share this. It's just, you can have a private think about that. Okay, I'll move us on then, because I want to allow a few minutes if anybody has any questions before we finish. But before we wrap up, I just want to take a moment to highlight, sorry, I know this is a bit shameless self-promotion, but just to highlight some of the services I offer around learning enablement. So I do things like offering learning needs discovery workshops, where we might explore collective learning needs in a team, for example, or in a group, and how to address them in a kind of joined up way. I also offer workshops that focus on specific areas of learning capability, so like feedback and reflective practice. I think someone mentioned reflective practice in the chat earlier. Or I also do one-to-one coaching to help people become more strategic in their learning, and just generally cultivate healthier habits around learning. So these are just some examples of some of the things that I do as learning as a service. And if you want to learn any more about them, or ask any more questions about these kind of things, then just feel free to connect with me after the talk. But yeah, that's all I think we've got time for today. There's a link here to various stuff that you might find interesting or useful in relation to this talk. There's many more tools for learning. If you do try anything and you find it useful, then I'd love to hear about it. But other than that, thank you very much for listening and participating. And I'll hand back over to Beverly for fielding questions.
Hi, thank you very much. Sorry, I'm struggling with my screen. I've got bits everywhere. Yeah, thanks, Sorrel. That's really, really, really interesting. So while we kind of wait to see if anyone thinks there's some questions to put in the chat, I'm gonna ask something. So how would you advise, or how can we help people who are coming out of the traditional education system to see the importance and be able to adapt this on more autonomous learning?
That's a really good question. I suppose the first of all, it's about sort of recognizing value, or recognizing the limitations of their own kind of approach to learning. So I don't know, I wonder if, like anything else, it needs to be framed within a, there needs to be a goal, something that they're working on, or something. I feel like it's quite hard to just come up with a general answer to that. Like, I'm not going to say it depends, but
It depends.
But
yeah,
what the problem is for them, what is it what's self-limiting, what's limiting them, and trying to, figure out from that what the connection is with the learning capability, with what learning behaviours they're missing. Does that make sense? I don't know, maybe other people have a better answer or a different answer.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so maybe being more reflective on kind of themselves, and understanding that there are different ways of going about it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah, as I said, based on, what is the issue, what is the thing that's holding them back? Maybe then that's the opportunity to direct them towards ways of learning, ways of thinking that they haven't, tools that they haven't previously encountered that could help them resolve that particular issue.
Okay. Thank you. So I haven't got any questions in the chat, but lots of thank yous at the moment. Oh, I think yeah. So I've got the topic of learning is not discussed much in information technology, environment and systems. this would help with continuous learning and probably reduce cost.
I'd agree with that. I think it's too often seen as a cost center. Like learning is something that's going to cost the company money, and it's not really going to offer anything. It's not going to generate value in of itself. When actually, I don't think that's the right way to think about it. Learning can lead to innovation, creativity, that self-healing system. So it has a huge amount of value. So I'd agree with that comment, definitely.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions? Oh, Paul's got his hand up.
Yeah, it was really just some reflections. So there's 2 points really. Number one is I've seen no end of systems being rolled out which have failed because the learning side has not been addressed properly. But basically, go and learn it yourself, and very little thoughts about training and how people might want to adapt to it. I think that's what I've seen, real system failure on that side. I don't know if that's your experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and to recognize it's not just giving people the information they need to be able to use the system, but also recognizing that it requires behavioral change, like adopting a new technical system. How does that affect them? Them as a social system. How does it affect them as individuals? There's more to untangle, isn't there?
Yeah, I think the other one I've used is if I've had to learn about a topic. So I've had to work a lot in mergers, acquisitions, and divestments. So I had to learn about identity and access management. This is just an example. And the way I treated that was, I knew nothing really about it in terms of its theory. I'm going to learn about it so I can deliver a lecture at work. So starting from nothing to actually being recognised as possibly an expert, maybe, that helped me because I had to be confident about the topic. I didn't have to know about everything, but enough that I could actually deliver confidently a lecture.
It's a great way to learn, isn't it? To teach others.
Okay, so doesn't look like we've got any more questions. I can't see any hands up. If anyone does want to put their hands up to ask a question rather than type, feel free to do so. Pause a moment to give people a chance. I'm definitely going to use some of the tools with my first year students who we get to kind of reflect on their career aspirations and the knowledge and skills they're going to need for it. And I definitely need some tools to help to focus them on the task, because they tend to struggle a little bit just leaving them to reflect. So I think I like the SWOT analysis one, but yeah.
Oh, brilliant. I'd love to hear how that goes.
Yeah, but I like not using weaknesses though. I don't like the term weakness.
No. And yeah, I don't know if there's a better term even than growth edges. I don't know if that's too hard to understand, but yeah, something other than weaknesses, which doesn't seem very constructive.
Yeah, it's an area of improvement, but then that's a bit wordy.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. Looks like no more questions, but another thank you for the interesting talk. So yeah, I think it's been great, and hopefully I'll definitely be in touch, and we'll.
Oh, well, thanks very much for having me, and yeah, I do hope the tool's useful. I hope your students get something out of it.
Yeah, I hope they get better grades. So,
or they might just go away with something that's useful for life,
Yes. Yeah, I think that's setting them up better for the rest of their course and for their future careers is kind of what I need to do, and giving them an easier way of actually being able to do that, because most of them have come straight out of sixth form or college, into a very different way of learning, and they can struggle. So any tools that I can use to help is good. Okay.
That's brilliant. Yeah. And then if they're going on for a job in IT, then they're familiar with SWOT analysis, which is another perk.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for joining. Hopefully we'll see you at some future events after the summer, or we may have one in July, but we're just working on that. But keep an eye out for other events hosted by the branch, and obviously I'm sure Sorrel will be happy for people to connect on LinkedIn and kind of continue the conversation. Okay, so I hope everyone has a great rest of the evening and a good week, and hopefully see some of you soon.